Racist teacher throws bleach on black girl's afro. Unaware her father is watching an act of cruelty in the classroom reveals the teacher's true colors, but a silent observer has the power to expose her. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily in room 203 as Mrs. Margaret Thompson moved between the lab tables, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The science classroom smelled of cleaning supplies and chalk dust, a familiar combination that usually meant another day of chemical reactions and formulas. 28 students sat at their black-topped lab tables, most of them focused on the whiteboard where Mrs. Thompson had written the day's lesson about catalysts and reactants. At the third table from the back, Aaliyah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The metal lab stool creaked as she tried to adjust her position, her fingers absently working to smooth down a section of her hair that had come loose from its carefully arranged style. The morning humidity had caused her hair to expand slightly, and she was trying to maintain the neat appearance she'd worked on before school. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried through the room as she explained the concept of chemical reactions, but her eyes kept darting to Aaliyah's movement. The teacher's expression grew increasingly rigid with each glance, her lips pressing into a thinner line. Other students began to notice the tension building, their attention shifting between their teacher and their classmate. The demonstration table at the front of the room held various bottles and beakers, set up for what was supposed to be a simple experiment showing how different substances react. Mrs. Thompson had been explaining the properties of common household chemicals, including bleach, and their molecular structures. But her teaching rhythm became more clipped, more aggressive, as Aaliyah continued her subtle movements. Without warning, Mrs. Thompson strode to Aaliyah's table. The classroom fell silent except for the sound of the teacher's footsteps. Students held their breath, recognizing the dangerous glint in their teacher's eyes. Mrs. Thompson grabbed the bottle of bleach from the demonstration table as she passed it, her knuckles white around its plastic neck. "Since you seem more concerned with your hair than with science, perhaps we should combine the two lessons," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made several students flinch. Before anyone could react, she uncapped the bottle and tilted it over Aaliyah's head, letting several drops fall onto the girl's hair. "This is a perfect demonstration of adaptation," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice taking on a mock educational tone. "Sometimes we need to change to fit in with our environment. Wouldn't you agree, Aaliyah?" The classroom froze in horror. Some students gasped, others looked away, and a few reached for their phones under their desks. Aaliyah sat perfectly still, shock and humiliation washing over her face as she processed what had just happened. The chemical smell of bleach cut through the air, sharp and accusatory. Outside the classroom window, Marcus had been walking past the school after dropping off some paperwork at the front office. He often took this route, knowing it passed by his daughter's science classroom. It was a small way of feeling connected to Aaliyah's day, even if she didn't always notice him. But this time, what he saw through the window made his blood run cold. The scene unfolded before him like a nightmare in slow motion. Through the large classroom windows, he watched his daughter's shoulders hunch forward as Mrs. Thompson stood over her, the bleach bottle still held aloft like a weapon. Marcus felt his heart constrict, a physical pain spreading through his chest as he witnessed his child being humiliated. His hands pressed against the cold glass L, leaving momentary prints that faded like ghosts. The other students' faces reflected a mix of shock and discomfort, but none moved to help. Marcus recognized the paralysis of witness trauma, the same kind he'd experienced in his own youth when confronted with acts of prejudice. The familiar smell of bleach seemed to reach him even through the window, carrying with it memories of similar incidents from his own past, incidents he'd hoped his daughter would never have to experience. The front door of their modest two-story house slammed open as Aaliyah burst in, her backpack dropping heavily to the floor. Marcus followed close behind, his car keys still clutched tightly in his hand after the rushed drive home. Aaliyah's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she rushed toward the living room, the lingering chemical smell of bleach trailing behind her like an unwanted shadow. "Baby, wait," Marcus called out, his voice caught between anger and concern. He watched as his daughter collapsed onto their worn brown couch, her face buried in her hands. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows highlighted the damaged spots in her hair where the bleach had already begun to take effect, creating irregular patches of lighter color. "I hate her," Aaliyah choked out between sobs. "I hate that school. Why did she do that to me?" Her words came out muffled through her fingers, but the pain in her voice cut through the room like a knife. Marcus sat beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. His work shirt would be stained with tears and makeup, but he couldn't care less about that now. "Listen to me," Marcus said firmly, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "What Mrs. Thompson did was wrong. Not just wrong, it was illegal. And I promise you, she won't get away with this." He felt Aaliyah nod against his chest, her breathing still irregular, but starting to calm. Within an hour, Marcus's phone was buzzing constantly with messages from other parents. Word had spread quickly through the school's parent network, aided by videos some students had managed to capture on their phones. The incident had sparked immediate outrage, particularly among other parents of color who had long harbored concerns about Mrs. Thompson's behavior. Lisa Chun, whose son was in Aaliyah's class, was the first to suggest an emergency meeting of the Parent-Teacher Association. "This isn't an isolated incident," she wrote in the group chat. "My Kevin has come home with stories before, but nothing this blatant. We need to act now." The following evening, the school's library was packed beyond capacity. Parents sat in every available chair, stood along the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The usual polite chatter that preceded PTA meetings was replaced by an intense, focused energy. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his hands gripping the podium as he surveyed the crowd. "What happened to my daughter yesterday wasn't just about hair," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. "It was about power. About a teacher who thought she could humiliate a child and get away with it because that's what's always happened before." The room fell silent as Marcus continued, describing not just the incident with Aaliyah, but building a larger picture of systemic issues within the school. Other parents began raising their hands, sharing their own children's experiences, stories of subtle discrimination, of lowered expectations, of dismissive treatment that had gone unreported for fear of retaliation. Sandra Rodriguez, a mother of 3, stood up without waiting to be called on. "My eldest graduated last year," she said, her voice shaking. "She never told me until after graduation how Mrs. Thompson would make comments about her accent, suggest she take easier classes because English wasn't her first language. I thought she was just being sensitive. I should have listened." The meeting stretched well beyond its scheduled time as more parents came. Forward. What had started as a response to a single incident was revealing a deeper pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. Marcus took notes furiously, documenting each story, each incident, building a case that would be impossible to ignore. By the end of the evening, they had formed a committee dedicated to addressing discrimination in the school. Parents volunteered for different roles. Some would gather more documentation, others would research legal options, and still others would work on developing proposals for cultural sensitivity, training, and curriculum changes. As the library finally began to empty, Marcus felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The community's response had exceeded his expectations, but he knew this was just the beginning of a longer fight. He gathered his notes, his mind already planning the next steps. This wasn't just about justice for Aaliyah anymore. It had become about changing the system that had allowed such behavior to flourish in the first place. The school's auditorium buzzed with activity as students gathered for drama club tryouts. Aaliyah stood in the wings, clutching her audition script with trembling hands. 2 weeks had passed since the incident in Mrs. Thompson's class, and this was her first step toward reclaiming her space in the school community. Her friend Jasmine, a fellow 7th grader who had encouraged her to join the club, stood beside her. "You've got this," Jasmine whispered, squeezing Aaliyah's arm. "Remember what Ms. Rodriguez said. The drama club needs more diverse voices." The drama teacher had been particularly welcoming, making it clear that this year's productions would focus on celebrating different cultural stories. When Aaliyah's name was called, she stepped onto the stage. The spotlight felt warm on her skin as she began performing a monologue from A Raisin in the Sun. Her voice, initially quiet, grew stronger with each line. She had chosen this piece deliberately, wanting to honor both her heritage and her current struggle. As she spoke beneath his words about identity and dreams, she felt something shift inside her. The following week, cast lists went up. Aaliyah had landed a leading role in the spring production, a modern adaptation of African folktales. During rehearsals, she found herself surrounded by a supportive group of students who shared their own stories of feeling different or out of place. The drama club became more than just an after-school activity. It transformed into a safe haven where diversity was celebrated rather than criticized. I thought about quitting school after what happened. Aaliyah confided in Jasmine one afternoon as they worked on their costumes. They sat cross-legged on the auditorium floor, surrounded by fabric swatches and sketch papers. But being here doing this, it feels like I'm proving her wrong just by existing. Jasmine looked up from the beadwork she was adding to a costume piece. You know what? Mrs. Thompson did us all a favor without meaning to. Look around. Half these kids never would have joined drama club if you hadn't come first. You made it cool to be different. The spring performance arrived sooner than expected. The auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and students. From behind the curtain, Aaliyah peeked out to see her father sitting in the front row, his phone ready to record every moment. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Aaliyah commanded the stage with a presence that seemed to transcend her 12 years. Her character, a young girl discovering her ancestral powers, resonated deeply with the audience. When she delivered her final monologue about embracing one's true self, several people were wiping away tears. After the performance, as students and parents mingled in the lobby, Aaliyah found herself surrounded by younger students, particularly girls of color, all eager to talk about the show and ask how they could join drama club next year. She caught ETS of their conversations with their parents. Did you see her hair? It's just like mine. Can I wear my braids like that? Later that evening, Aaliyah sat at her vanity mirror, carefully removing her stage makeup. Her reflection showed a different person than the girl who had run home, crying weeks ago. The bleach patches in her hair had grown out somewhat, but instead of hiding them, she had incorporated them into a new style that made them look intentional, artistic even. You know what's weird, Dad? She said as Marcus passed by her room. I used to spend so much time trying to make my hair look acceptable for school. Now I just wanted to look like me. She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Thompson wanted me to adapt, right? Well, I did, just not the way she meant. Marcus leaned against her doorframe, watching his daughter's transformation with pride and a touch of amazement. The incident that had threatened to break her had instead revealed her strength. You're not just adapting, he replied. You're evolving. There's a difference. The school gymnasium had been transformed for the all-school assembly. Rows of folding chairs filled the space where basketball games usually took place. Marcus stood in the empty hallway outside, running through his speech one final time. His reflection in the trophy case showed a man in a carefully pressed suit, chosen deliberately for this moment. Inside his briefcase were dozens of documented incidents, testimonials from students and parents, and copies of educational policies that Mrs. Thompson had violated. He'd spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, consulting with education advocates and civil rights attorneys. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about systemic change. The gymnasium doors opened, and students began filing in. Marcus watched as Mrs. Thompson entered through a side door, her usual air of authority somewhat diminished but still present. She sat near the front, surrounded by a small group of supportive faculty members. Her appearance was immaculate as always, but there was a tension in her shoulders that betrayed her anxiety. Mr. Williams, Principal Roberts approached Marcus. Are you sure you want to do this in such a public forum? We could arrange a private meeting with the school board instead. The concern in his voice was genuine, but Marcus detected a hint of institutional self-preservation in the suggestion. With all due respect, Principal Roberts, Marcus replied, straightening his tie. Privacy is what allowed this behavior to continue for so long. Sometimes, the truth needs witnesses. The principal nodded reluctantly and moved to take his place on the stage. As the assembly began, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. Students whispered among themselves, many already aware of why this unusual gathering had been called. Some held signs they'd made supporting Aaliyah and other students who had faced discrimination. Mrs. Thompson was called to speak first, a tactical decision that Marcus had anticipated. She approached the podium with practiced confidence, though her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "What happened in my classroom was a regrettable misunderstanding," she began, her voice carrying across the gymnasium. "As educators, we sometimes must make split-second decisions to maintain order and focus in our classrooms. My actions, while perhaps poorly chosen, were intended as a teachable moment about laboratory safety and appropriate classroom behavior." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Several students shook their heads, and some parents in attendance scoffed audibly. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice growing defensive as she spoke about her years of service, her dedication to education, and her alleged commitment to all student success. When Marcus finally took the podium, the gymnasium fell silent. He placed his notes on the lectern, but didn't immediately look at them. Instead, he surveyed the room, making eye contact with various students and parents who had shared their stories with him. "Mrs. Thompson speaks of teachable moments," he began, his voice steady and clear. "So let's talk about what my daughter and many other students in this room have really learned in her classroom. They've learned that their natural appearance is somehow inappropriate. They've learned that their cultural identity is something to be corrected rather than celebrated. They've learned that speaking up about discrimination might lead to retaliation." He pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. "I have here 17 documented incidents of discriminatory behavior from Mrs. Thompson's classroom over the past 3 years. I have testimonials from former students who are now in college, still carrying the scars of their experiences in her class. I have copies of emails where concerns were raised and subsequently dismissed." The gymnasium remained silent as Marcus continued, methodically presenting evidence and connecting it to broader patterns of institutional bias. Mrs. Thompson's face grew increasingly pale as he spoke, her earlier defensiveness crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence. "But most importantly," Marcus concluded, his voice breaking slightly, "I have my daughter's story. A story of a young girl who was physically and emotionally assaulted in a place where she should have felt safe. A story that would have remained just another whispered warning between students of color if we hadn't decided to stand up and say, 'No more.'" The silence that followed Marcus's speech lasted only moments before a student stood up from the middle of the gymnasium. James Chun, a sophomore whose brother had previously shared stories of discrimination, raised his hand. Principal Roberts nodded, allowing him to speak. "2 years ago," James began, his voice shaking but growing stronger, "Mrs. Thompson told me I should consider taking regular chemistry instead of AP because certain students might find the coursework too challenging." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm now top of my AP physics class." Like a dam breaking, more students began to stand. Sarah Rodriguez, a junior with long dark hair, spoke next. She suggested I join the Spanish club instead of debate team, saying I'd feel more comfortable with my own kind. "I'm the debate team captain now." The testimonies continued, each more powerful than the last. Students of various backgrounds shared their experiences, painting a clear picture of systematic discrimination that had gone unchecked for years. Mrs. Thompson's face grew increasingly ashen as student after student stood to speak. A particularly moving moment came when Michael Foster, a white student-athlete, stood up. "Last semester, I was struggling in chemistry. Mrs. Thompson offered me extra help and told me not to worry because some people just take longer to grasp scientific concepts. But when Aaliyah asked for help the same day, she said there wasn't enough time and suggested maybe science wasn't her strong suit." The contrast in treatment was stark, and even Mrs. Thompson's few remaining supporters began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. She attempted to interject, rising from her chair with an indignant expression. "These students are clearly misinterpreting." "Are we all misinterpreting?" Another voice cut through the gymnasium. It was Ms. Martinez, a history teacher who had remained quiet until now. "Because I've watched for years as you've directed talented students away from STEM courses based on nothing but your own prejudices." Mrs. Thompson's attempt to maintain control crumbled visibly. Her usual authoritative demeanor faltered as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. She looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only stern faces and crossed arms. "This is absurd," she sputtered, her voice rising with desperation. "I have taught in this district for 20 years. I have letters of recommendation from parents who look like you and students who fit your idea of what a good student should be." Another teacher interrupted. More faculty members began to distance themselves from her, physically and metaphorically. The pressure in the room was palpable. Students who had never spoken up before found their voices, sharing smaller incidents that had seemed insignificant in isolation, but now formed part of a larger pattern. Parents in the audience nodded in recognition, some wiping away tears as they heard their own children's experiences echoed in other stories. One particularly powerful moment came when a group of alumni who had heard about the assembly through social media arrived and asked to speak. They shared how Mrs. Thompson's actions had affected their college choices and career paths, some admitting they had abandoned their dreams of pursuing science because of her discouragement. As the testimonies continued, Mrs. Thompson's isolation became complete. The small group of teachers who had initially sat with her had dispersed, leaving her alone in her section of chairs. Her attempts to defend herself grew weaker, eventually falling silent as the weight of 2 decades of discriminatory behavior crashed down around her. The assembly, originally scheduled for an hour, stretched well into the afternoon. No one seemed to mind. This had become more than just a confrontation with one teacher. It was a long overdue reckoning with institutional racism and bias in their school. Principal Roberts stood at the podium, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a more somber, reflective stance. The assembly had lasted far longer than planned, but no one had left. The weight of testimony and shared experiences had transformed the gymnasium into something closer to a courtroom of public opinion. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice echoing through the now quiet space. "We will be forming a diversity and inclusion committee. This committee will have real power to review policies, curriculum, and complaints." He paused, making eye contact with various community members. "And we're not just looking for volunteers. We're offering paid positions to ensure this work is taken seriously." The announcement caused a stir of surprise. Paid positions meant budget allocation, which meant real commitment from the administration. Principal Roberts continued, outlining the immediate steps the school would take. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, curriculum review focusing on representation, and a new anonymous reporting system for discrimination incidents. Aaliyah, sitting in the front row beside her father, raised her hand. When acknowledged, she stood, her voice clear and confident, a marked change from the girl who had run home crying weeks before. "I'd like to volunteer to be a student representative on the committee," she said, "and I have some ideas for our first workshop." Principal Roberts nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Ms. Williams, I think you're exactly who we need. Would you be willing to share your ideas now?" Aaliyah moved to the podium, pulling out her phone where she'd been taking notes throughout the assembly. "First," she began, "we need to talk about what inclusion really means. It's not just about letting people in, it's about making them feel like they belong." Over the next 15 minutes, Aaliyah outlined a workshop series that would bring together students, teachers, and parents. Her proposal included interactive exercises, guest speakers from the community, and practical scenarios drawn from real experiences. The audience listened intently, many taking notes. "The most important part," she concluded, "is that we need to make this ongoing. One workshop won't fix everything. We need regular meetings, continuous feedback, and real consequences when people don't meet our community standards." The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. Several teachers immediately volunteered to help organize the workshops, and students began signing up for various roles in the initiative. Even some of the more skeptical faculty members seemed impressed by the thoughtfulness of the proposal. The first workshop was scheduled for the following week. Aaliyah worked with a team of students and teachers to prepare the material, drawing from her own experience, but also incorporating other stories and perspectives. They created interactive exercises that would help participants understand different forms of discrimination and their impact. During the workshop, Aaliyah stood before a packed classroom, now transformed into a safe space for difficult conversations. Today, she began, we're going to talk about microaggressions. Those small comments or actions that might seem harmless but actually carry deep prejudice. The session included role-playing exercises where participants switched perspectives, experiencing situations from different viewpoints. Teachers who had never considered certain behaviors problematic began to understand their impact. Students who had remained silent about their experiences found their voices. The workshop's success led to immediate plans for more sessions. Other schools in the district began requesting information about the program, and local news outlets picked up the story of how one incident had catalyzed meaningful institutional change. Principal Roberts, watching from the back of the room during one session, leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "Your daughter is doing more for this school than 20 years of diversity seminars ever did." Marcus nodded, pride evident in his expression as he watched Aaliyah guide another group through an exercise about cultural sensitivity. Local news vans lined the street outside the school, their satellite dishes reaching into the gray morning sky. The incident, initially contained within school walls, had exploded into public consciousness after a student's cell phone video went viral on social media. Channel 5's education reporter stood in front of the school's brick facade, microphone in hand, delivering the morning's update. Sources inside the school district confirmed that this isn't the first complaint against teacher Margaret Thompson, the reporter stated. Documents obtained by our investigative team show a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning nearly 2 decades. Inside the school, the atmosphere was tense. Teachers hurried through hallways, avoiding reporters' questions, while students whispered about the latest developments. Margaret Thompson arrived earlier than usual, attempting to avoid the media presence, but several parents spotted her and began recording with their phones. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any response to the allegations?" one parent called out. "What about the other incidents that have come to light?" Thompson clutched her briefcase tighter, quickening her pace. "This is all being blown out of proportion," she responded, her voice tight with frustration. "These children are sensitive to everything these days. In my time, we understood discipline and respect." Her words, captured on video and shared within hours, only fueled the growing controversy. Social media exploded with responses from former students, each sharing their own experiences with Thompson. The hashtag Justice for Aaliyah began trending locally, then nationally. Marcus received a call from a civil rights organization offering legal support. "Mr. Williams," the representative said, "what happened to your daughter represents a broader pattern of institutional racism in education. We'd like to help you pursue this case." Meanwhile, Thompson attempted to control the narrative through administrative channels. She scheduled a meeting with the school board, bringing along carefully selected parent supporters and documentation of her teaching achievement. "These accusations are damaging my reputation," she argued. "I've dedicated my life to education. These students are trying to paint me as some sort of monster because they can't handle constructive criticism." But her defense crumbled as more evidence emerged. A former teaching assistant came forward with emails showing Thompson's explicit bias in grading. Security camera footage from the hallway outside her classroom revealed a pattern of different treatment towards students of different backgrounds. The pressure began affecting Thompson's classroom performance. Students reported her becoming increasingly defensive and agitated. During one class, she snapped at a student for asking about chemical reactions, claiming they were trying to provoke another incident. The teachers' union found itself in a difficult position. While typically standing with teachers in disputes, the evidence against Thompson was overwhelming. After reviewing the documentation, union representatives quietly informed her that while they would ensure due process, they could not defend her actions. "We have to consider the welfare of all students," the union representative stated in a carefully worded press release. "While we support our teachers, we also acknowledge our responsibility to maintain a safe and equitable learning environment." Local community organizations began organizing protests outside school board meetings. Signs reading "Protect Our Children" and "No Place for Hate" became regular fixtures outside the school. The story caught the attention of national education blogs, which used the incident to discuss broader issues of discrimination in schools. The school board, initially hoping to handle the situation quietly, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Parents demanded transparency about how previous complaints against Thompson had been handled. Questions arose about the board's oversight and accountability measures. Marcus and Aaliyah's phones rang constantly with interview requests from journalists wanting to tell their story. They chose their appearances carefully, focusing on outlets that would address the systemic issues rather than just the sensational aspects of the incident. This isn't just about one teacher or one incident, Marcus explained during a radio interview. This is about changing a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked for years. How many other Mrs. Thompsons are out there, slowly crushing our children's spirits? The school district's administrative building stood imposing against the autumn sky as board members filed in for what would become a pivotal meeting. The parking lot overflowed with cars, forcing many attendees to park blocks away. Students, parents, and community members gathered outside, their signs and voices unified in purpose. The board's decision to require Thompson to undergo diversity training had backfired spectacularly. "Training isn't enough," read one protester's sign. "Our children deserve better," declared another. The peaceful demonstration had drawn hundreds, including students from neighboring schools who had heard similar stories from their own classrooms. Inside the building, the boardroom couldn't contain the crowd. People stood along walls, sat on floors, and spilled in the hallways. Security guards looked nervous, but the atmosphere, while tense, remained controlled. This wasn't a mob. It was an organized community demanding change. Aaliyah and Marcus arrived together, now recognized figures in the movement they'd inadvertently started. They had spent the morning with a group of young activists, planning their approach. These weren't just high school students with protest signs. They came armed with statistics, policy proposals, and specific demands for institutional change. "We're not just here about Mrs. Thompson anymore," Aaliyah addressed the board, her voice stronger than ever. "We're here because every student deserves to feel safe and respected in their classroom. We're here because this system needs to change." The young activists had done their homework. They presented research showing how implicit bias affected student performance, statistics on disciplinary actions broken down by race, and comparisons with other districts that had successfully implemented comprehensive diversity programs. Marcus followed with the legal perspective, backed by civil rights attorneys who had joined their cause. "The choice before you isn't whether to act," he stated firmly. "The choice is whether you want to be remembered as the board that led positive change or the one that had to be forced into it." One by one, students took the podium, sharing their stories. But unlike the previous meetings, they came with solutions. They proposed a student-led diversity council with real power to review policies. They suggested curriculum changes that would better reflect their community's diversity. They demanded transparent reporting of discrimination complaints and clear consequences for violations. The protest outside grew as the meeting continued. Local news crews captured the scene as students performed spoken-word pieces about their experiences, their voices carrying through the building's open windows. Parents organized refreshment stations, making sure protesters stayed hydrated and energized. Thompson supporters tried to speak as well, but their arguments about traditional values and maintaining standards felt hollow against the well-researched presentations of the students. When one supporter suggested that kids these days are too sensitive, a group of alumni stood up, sharing how Thompson's actions had affected their career choices and self-esteem years after graduation. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as evidence mounted. Their initial solution of mandatory training looked increasingly inadequate. The community wasn't just asking for Band-Aid solutions. They wanted systemic change, and they had come prepared to fight for it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the boardroom windows, the message was clear. This movement wasn't going away. The young activists had transformed their anger into action, their pain into purpose. They had learned to use the system's own rules and procedures to fight for change. The board announced they would need time to review all the proposals, but the community had anticipated this response. They had already planned follow-up actions, social media campaigns, and continued pressure until real change was achieved. This wasn't just a protest. It was the beginning of a sustained movement for educational equity. The morning news showed aerial footage of the school, where news vans from national networks had joined the local media presence. What had started as a local story had exploded into a national conversation about discrimination in education. Hashtag Justice for Aaliyah had evolved into hashtag Change the System, trending nationwide. Margaret Thompson's attempt to control the narrative through a television interview backfired spectacularly. Sitting in a studio under harsh lights, she appeared defensive and out of touch. "These children need to learn that the world won't coddle them," she insisted, her voice sharp. "When I started teaching, parents supported educators' decisions." The interview went viral for all the wrong reasons. Social media exploded with clips of Thompson's most tone-deaf statements, each one generating thousands of responses from educators, parents, and students across the country. Education experts appeared on news programs, analyzing the incident within the broader context of systemic racism in schools. Marcus and Aaliyah's interview on a major morning show provided a stark contrast. They spoke with dignity and purpose, focusing on solutions rather than anger. "This isn't about punishment," Aaliyah explained, appearing poised beyond her years. "It's about making sure every student feels safe and valued." In their classroom, online support grew exponentially. A crowdfunding campaign to support the student-led diversity initiatives reached its goal within hours. Educational organizations offered resources and support. Civil rights groups provided legal expertise. The incident had become a catalyst for a larger movement. Thompson's online presence crumbled under scrutiny. Former students found her old social media posts, revealing a pattern of problematic comments stretching back years. Professional organizations began distancing themselves. The teachers' union, after reviewing all evidence, withdrew their support entirely. "While we believe in due process and protecting teachers' rights," their statement read, "we cannot defend actions that directly harm students and violate the core principles of education." Local news investigated Thompson's employment history, uncovering previous incidents at other schools that had been quietly resolved through transfers. Each revelation added pressure on the school board to take decisive action. The story had evolved from a single incident to an exposé of systemic failures in addressing discrimination. During another television appearance, Aaliyah and Marcus shared their hopes for the future. "We want to create lasting change," Aaliyah said, her voice clear and confident. "This isn't just about removing one teacher. It's about building a school system where every student feels they belong." The media attention brought unexpected allies. Corporate leaders offered internship programs focusing on diversity in STEM fields. Educational technology companies proposed partnerships to develop anti-bias training tools. Universities reached out about studying the movement as a model for institutional change. Thompson's isolation grew complete as colleagues publicly distanced themselves. Her few remaining supporters found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their own biases. The pressure began affecting her health, and she started calling in sick frequently. Meanwhile, the story continued to evolve in the press. News features explored similar incidents nationwide, revealing a pattern that sparked conversations about educational reform across the country. Education reporters began investigating how other districts handled discrimination complaints, leading to a broader examination of systemic issues. The online discourse reached a turning point when a group of teachers from Thompson's previous schools came forward. Their testimonies, published in a lengthy online exposé, detailed years of witnessed discrimination that had gone unaddressed. The article went viral, drawing attention from educational policymakers and civil rights organizations. As public pressure mounted, Thompson's position became increasingly untenable. Her attempts to defend herself only made things worse, each statement revealing deeper layers of bias. The school board faced mounting pressure to take definitive action, not just against Thompson, but to address the systemic issues her case had exposed. The final school board meeting began in an atmosphere charged with anticipation. The room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching via live stream in nearby classrooms. After weeks of investigation, testimonies, and mounting pressure, the moment of decision had arrived. Principal Roberts took the podium first, his demeanor grave. After a thorough review of all evidence and consultation with legal experts, The board has reached several decisions. He paused, adjusting his glasses. First, regarding Mrs. Margaret Thompson's employment with our district. The room fell silent. Thompson sat rigid in her chair, surrounded by empty seats, a physical manifestation of her isolation. Her attorney whispered something in her ear, but she remained stiffly upright, staring straight ahead. Mrs. Thompson's employment is terminated, effective immediately, Principal Roberts announced. Furthermore, we will be forwarding our findings to the State Board of Education for review of her teaching credentials. The announcement triggered a wave of relief through the room, but Roberts raised his hand for silence. However, this is just the beginning of our response. What followed was a comprehensive outline of institutional changes. Mandatory quarterly diversity training for all staff, a new curriculum review committee focused on representation, and the establishment of a permanent student-led diversity council with real authority. Most significantly, they announced the creation of a new position, Director of Equity and Inclusion, with substantial budget and oversight powers. As Thompson left the building for the final time, escorted by security to protect her from media cameras, she attempted one last defense. "You're all making a terrible mistake," she declared to the reporters. 20 years of service destroyed by oversensitive children who... But her words were drowned out by the cheers erupting from inside the building. Meanwhile, Aaliyah received news that would change her life. A prestigious leadership program had offered her a full scholarship, impressed by her role in catalyzing institutional change. The program, designed to develop young activists into future leaders, would allow her to share her experience with students nationwide. "Your daughter," the program director told Marcus, "has demonstrated the kind of leadership we need in the next generation. She didn't just fight against something, she fought for something better." The school's transformation became a model for other districts. The curriculum changes they implemented were praised by educational experts and adopted by schools across the country. The Student-Led Diversity Council's framework was published as a guide for other institutions looking to make meaningful changes. The final scene played out in the school's newly renovated auditorium, where Aaliyah stood before a crowd of students, parents, and educators from across the state. She was no longer the frightened girl from Mrs. Thompson's class. She had become a confident young leader. "What happened in that science classroom was terrible," she began, her voice strong and clear. "But what came after? That's the real story. We learned that change is possible when we stand together. We learned that our voices matter. Most importantly, we learned that justice isn't just about punishing wrong. It's about creating something right." As she spoke, Marcus watched from the back of the room, tears in his eyes. He saw not just his daughter on that stage, but a symbol of hope for every student who had ever felt marginalized or silenced. The incident that had threatened to break her had instead revealed her strength and helped forge a path for others to follow. The story ended not with a victory over one teacher's discrimination, but with the beginning of a new chapter in educational equity. The school's commitment to inclusion became part of its identity, with each new class of students adding their voices to the ongoing conversation about justice, acceptance, and the power of standing up for what's right. As Aaliyah concluded her speech, the applause wasn't just for her. It was for every student who would now walk through those school doors knowing they belonged there, exactly as they were.